In the dark of the midnight have I oft hid my face, while the storms howl above me, and there's no hiding place. Amidst the crash of the thunder, precious Lord, hear my cry. Keep me safe till the storm passes by. Till the storm passes over, till the thunder sounds no more, till the clouds roll forever from the sky. Hold me fast, let me stand in the hollow of thy hand. Keep me safe till the storm passes by.
We just finished the lecture on the experience of 1951 at the delegation session. And at this particular lecture, we want to cover some other issues in regards to what happened after 1951. 1951 was a tragedy, but what happened during the next year causes even greater concern to me as I look at it from a historical perspective. But before we go after 1951, I would like to consider a couple of points. And the particular thing is, when does a general conference session have authority? What gives it that power to make decisions and to be a legal institution? In Gospel Workers, page 490, it tells us, God has ordained that the representatives of His church from all parts of the earth, when assembled in a general conference session, shall have authority. Now, I think this statement is very clear. It is not when a small group of men get together, but it is when representatives from all around the world get together, then the general conference has authority. Now, when does the general conference lose her authority? Or when should her decisions not be recognized, neither by the delegates nor by the people, as being the voice of God? We often refer to the general conference session as the voice of God, and we don't have time to clarify and understand that particular term either at this point. But we do understand that there is a voice in the general conference session, and it is at a specific time. In Volume 9, Testament for the Church, page 260, at times when a small group of men entrusted with the general management of the work have, in the name of the general conference, sought to carry out unwise plans and to restrict God's work, I have said that I cannot longer regard the voice of the general conference represented by these few men as the voice of God. It's very clear, isn't it? When a small group of men called themselves the general conference, then she could not trust them. Let's consider some statistical information for a moment in regards to the general conference session of 1951. The Western European Union had 348 members, and of those 348, 2 were supposed to be delegates. The German Union had 984 members, 4 delegates. The South European Union, 336 members, and somehow in there they had 3 delegates there. This is according to the report that was given by Brother Kotzel at the session. The Scandinavian Union, 262 members, 2 delegates. The Yugoslavian Union, 870 members with 4 delegates. The Hungarian Field, 350 members, 2 delegates. The Bulgarian field, 450 members, 2 delegates. Spain, 29 members, 1 delegate. Africa, 522 members, 2 delegates. Australia, 104 members, 1 delegate. North American Union, 97 members, 1 delegate. The South American division had some fields and unions there. The South American Union North had 581 members, 3 delegates. The South American Union South had 265 members, 2 delegates. The Brazilian Union, 813 members, 4 delegates. The Romanian Union, 4,500 members, 18 delegates. The Polish field, 117 members, 1 delegate. And the Czechoslovakian field, 80 members, 1 delegate. This is according to the report that Brother Kotzel gave at the 1951 session. In other words, the total membership was 10,708 members with a delegation of 53 delegates. Now, with those 10,708 members, there were other places that we weren't absolutely sure because of the borders being closed. The best records they could get was Russia had another 500 members, East European Union 197, the Baltic, they weren't quite sure. Some records indicate that there were about an additional nearly 1,000, 1,500 members in that area. And so when we look at this membership, at least there should have been 53 regular delegates, not including delegates at large, at the General Conference session of 1951. From these 53 delegates, there were only about 25 present in 1951. And of those 25, there was inclusion of delegates at large, not just regular delegates. There should have been 53 regular delegates in attendance at the session. These 25 actually represented 4,241 members. There were absent at least 28 additional delegates that could not be there. And that means that they were representing 6,467 members, the majority. It was the duty of our brethren to inform the delegates that the conference could not be held without the consent of the other unions and fields, who were the majority and who could not send their delegates. They had to have an authorization to hold that session. The testimonies say that the full authority is only established when the General Conference is represented from all parts of the world, not less than half. Volume 9, 260. I have been often instructed by the Lord that no man's judgment should be surrendered to the judgment of any other one man. We are never to surrender our individual judgment to any one individual. Going on, never should the mind of one man or the minds of a few men be regarded as sufficient in wisdom and power to control the work and to say what plans should be followed. Not just not of one man, but not even of a few men. But, it says, when in a general conference, the judgment of brethren assembled from all parts of the field is exercised, private independence and private judgment must not be stubbornly maintained, but surrendered. What does this statement tell us? It is very clear here that a few men, a small group of men in comparison to the delegation of the entire world, is never to determine the direction of the church. And clearly, the minority of individuals, less than 50% of our membership was represented, 1951, should never determine the destiny of our denomination. The destiny is determined by the majority of delegates. Let me read this again. But when in a general conference, the judgment of the brethren assembled from all parts of the field is exercised, it is then that private independence and private judgment must not be stubbornly maintained, but surrendered. Never should a laborer regard as a virtue the persistent maintenance of his position of independence contrary to the decision of the general body. We need to understand what is the view of the general body, not of individual members. So when we consider the events of 1951, when we consider what took place at that time, it is very clear that that small group of individuals, 25 individuals, where there should have been over 50, well over 50, to be represented there, those individuals should never have determined the destiny of the Reform movement. But then what happened afterwards? But before we go there, let's continue the statement from Volume 9, page 260. At times when a small group of men entrusted with the general management of the work have, in the name of the General Conference, sought to carry out unwise plans and to restrict God's work, I have said that I could not longer regard the voice of the General Conference represented by these few men as the voice of God. So when a small group of people call themselves the General Conference, they are not the General Conference. That small group may be the officers of the General Conference, but they are not the General Conference. And when she could not entrust herself to their judgment, she said, I have no longer regarded them as the voice of the General Conference. But this is not saying that the decisions of a General Conference, listen to this, composed of an assembly of duly appointed representative men from all parts of the field should not be respected. In other words, when we are going to have a respect for a General Conference session, we have to look at those that are composed of an assembly of duly appointed individuals. That means there is a right way and a wrong way to appoint them. They are duly appointed by whom? By the fields in which they are representing. They are the ones that are to select delegates for the General Conference session. God has ordained that the representatives of His church from all parts of the earth, when assembled in a General Conference, shall have authority. That is when they have authority. Continuing on, the error that some are in danger of committing is in giving to the mind and judgment of one man or of a small group of men the full measure of authority and influence that God has vested in His church in the judgment and voice of the General Conference assembled to plan for the prosperity and the advancement of His work. Continuing on, Volume 9 has some very important statements for us to learn here. When this power which God has placed in the church is accredited wholly to one man, and he is invested with the authority to be judgment for other minds, then the true Bible order is changed. Satan's efforts upon such a man's mind would be most subtle and sometimes well nigh overpowering, for the enemy would hope that through his mind he could affect many others. Let us give to the highest organized authority in the church that which we are prone to give to one man or to a small group of men. According to the bylaws that were prepared, the duly accredited authority in 1951 would have been when 3 out of 5 delegates are present. And then that is quorum. That is when they have the right to call the session to order. That is the General Conference session. Now, for example, we have a committee of 5 individuals. When is that committee authorized to do the business of the church? When 3 are present, at least 3 are present. If 2 come and 3 are absent, can those 2 transact any business and make decisions for the majority? Clearly the answer is no. From the 53 delegates necessary, and this is 53 regular delegates, not including delegates at large, only 25 were present, out of which 4, of course, were unqualified delegates according to the testimonies. But for the sake of peace, The 11 did not bother with those 4 as strongly as they could have. The total of absent delegates was 28, representing the majority of members. Now, either that session was not qualified to transact any business, or we had to consider the proxy members to be included. Now, the proxy vote was not that one man had more than one vote, but that they had the authority to represent that particular field. If they are included, if these proxy votes are included, then the 11 represented the majority of the church. Regardless of what happened, of course, the unions and fields after a delegation session would have the opportunity to determine the legitimacy of an organization, especially if there was not enough delegates to start with. Now, after this, I hope this is clear as you evaluate this thing. We cannot have, as the terminology in America here is, you cannot have your cake and eat it at the same time. It is impossible. Either we accept the proxy vote, and the delegation was considered legal to transact business, or we consider the proxy vote is out of the question, and then what? Well, then the session had to stop, and there cannot be a session. And not only there cannot be a session at that time in 1951, then no subsequent session was considered legal to transact business until 1991. In which the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement held their session in Germany. At that time, the Eastern European countries were able to come for the very first time. And then you actually had a real delegation session. Instead of recognizing some of these things, maybe at least calling another session afterwards to resolve some of the issues of 1951, what happened? The subsequent year was a tragic year. As you remember, we had 2 particular organizations from the 1951 General Conference session. Of course, you had the third one too, but they did not even recognize 1948. And we'll kind of look at some of those statements a little bit clearer in a few minutes as well. But what did Brother Kotzel do, who was the president of one of those groups? Of those minority, both were minority groups as far as actual delegation is concerned. What did he do? Well, he decided to take the leadership of church by force. By force, we mean by court action. He took Brother Nikolic to court. And this is where Kotzel admits to initiating the court action in this document that we are going to show you. This is a letter that he prepared. He says, the Union Committee requested of Brother N the restitution of the Union property and name, which will be decided now on March 26th by the authorities by the court at Sacramento, California. The same thing will take place with respect to the General Conference name and property on May 7th. Notice his concern was for what? For the name of the church that was registered in 1949 and for the property of the church. And the court date was May 7th, 1952. He says, help us with your prayers that the Lord may restore to us what has been taken away from us by Brother N. That's no question of a brother against a brother. It is a sheer business matter which can only be settled by the authorities, with whom we are registered, both the Union Conference and the General Conference, for protection of the name and properties, and we shall have to accept the decision or sentence as pronounced. That is quite a sad state when you look at court affairs. For brethren really to take each other to court. The real court should have been when? The real court should be the church court. And the church court is another General Conference session. Call forth a brand new delegation session and let those delegates evaluate what happened in 1951 and base their judgment on the Bible and the spirit of prophecy rather than on the worldly measures that an earthly court would do. That's the right thing to do. And that should have been done. And that still can be done today. Another letter we can look at is by Brother Kramer, and Brother Kramer was, if you may remember, of the other group from Denver that they organized the International Committee, or as Brother Adamzak had put it, a general conference session with Brother Dershler as president. Now he wrote a letter to Luklelo on February 25th, 1952. He says, Nikolic wrote in a letter of August 7th, 1947, this is while Brother Nikolic was still in Australia. He is referring to this. Finally, we decided to take possession of the building without waiting for the court case. He went to a worldly court to bring Brother Williams to terms. Now this is happening here again in Sacramento, California, where Kotzel and Mueller have taken Nikolic to court, now for stealing their church property. The trial is beginning this month and may last for some time. Now this mentions that Brother Nikolic took Brother Williams to court in New Zealand. But in reality, Brother Nikolic never took anyone to court over church property. Here we present to you a letter from the Saunders and Henney barristers and solicitors, a letter dated March 9, 1953. And here's what he states. Regarding your letter of the 26th ultimo in connection with Mr. F.L. Williams, we will confirm that the matters relating to the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement in New Zealand and brought about by the defection of Mr. Williams were settled by mutual arrangements between all parties concerned, and that no legal proceedings or court action were taken in the movement's name against Mr. Williams respecting any property of the movement in this country. So according to this statement, the barristers, as they evaluated it, there was no court action. Another letter here is of H.J.A. Kuntz, letter dated June 2nd, 1952. And this letter, here's what he states. It was brought to my notice from our headquarters in Sacramento, California, that our former brethren, and especially those who took court action against us, alleged that in New Zealand, Brother D. Nikolic, while in Australia, during the year 1947, in the occasion of the trouble which occurred around the property there, also took court action. As I was entrusted by the New Zealand conference with the work there, and as a member of the committee in New Zealand during the time of Brother Nikolic's stay in Australian field of work, can testify that this rumor is entirely untrue and that its purpose is to misguide our brethren who are unable to have all the facts. So here's a brother who actually lived there, who actually worked there, and states that never happened. Going back to the court case in Sacramento, California, the court case brought about by Brother Kotzel against Brother Nikolic never actually went to court to be finalized. And here we present to you an article by the Sacramento Bee, dated May 7th, 1952. And here's what it states. Witnesses who were subpoenaed from 6 foreign countries to testify in Sacramento in a dispute over who are the proper officials of the Seventh-day Adventist Church today learned that they made the trip in vain. Keep in mind, according to the reporter, the issue was who are the officials of that church. Of course, he says the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Superior Judge Malcolm C. Glenn was requested to drop the suit. The litigants decided to let members of the church all over the world decide the question at a conference which probably will be held sometime this year in Germany. Well, that sounds like some good news. They're going to call for the new General Conference session and let the new General Conference session decide it. 8 witnesses, 2 each from Germany and Holland, and 1 each from Argentina, Brazil, Canada, and Australia, made the trip to Sacramento to testify at the trial of the suit. Subtitle, Groups Disagree. The dispute is between 2 groups, each of which claims control of the church records, books, and property. One group claims Carlos Kotzel of Germany. One of the witnesses subpoenaed is the rightful president. The other contends D. Nikolic of 3031 Franklin Boulevard has the right of title. Nikolic has possession of the books, records, and property. He says he was elected at a meeting of the General Conference May 24th, 1951 in the Netherlands. Kotzel contends he was elected to the presidency May 7th, 1951 at a meeting of the General Conference in the Netherlands. Sought writ. Kotzel filed a complaint seeking a writ of mandate which would have required Nikolic to turn over the church's property to him and settle the question of who are the proper officers. A similar action against Nikolic filed by the American unit of the movement has been taken under submission by Judge Glenn, who has not announced a decision yet. So there was another court case going with the union. Now, this particular court case was terminated. The court case was dismissed. It was not just dismissed at random, but rather there was an agreement signed between the two parties. The one that claimed Carlos Kotzel as the president and the one that claimed D. Nikolic as the president. And they signed an agreement. And here is the agreement, as you can take a look and file through this agreement here. We're going to read from it some particular portions that are important for us to consider. It says, number one, whereas the undersigned parties and each of them are members of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement General Conference, a corporation. And this is important. Keep in mind that both of these parties agreed to the fact that they were both members of the same church. This is in 1952. This is in May of 1952. Whereas, ever since the 20th day of May 1951, a dispute has existed between the undersigned parties concerning which, if any, of the undersigned are the duly elected, qualified, and acting officers of said corporation. Notice, what was the issue? And by the way, this is a signed declaration by both parties. This is a legal document that they signed stating what their issues are. Their issues are who are the leadership of the organization. Whereas an action was filed in the Superior Court of the State of California in and for the County of Sacramento on the 18th day of February 1952, wherein said corporation and Carlos Kotzel are named petitioners, and D. Nikolic et al. Are named respondents, by which said petitioners sought an adjudication of the foregoing dispute and an accounting in the said court. Whereas each of the undersigned parties did agree prior to entering the aforesaid dismissals that the foregoing disputes and questions in accounting were still open questions with them and had not been settled between them. So they realized that they did not agree on everything yet, specifically in financial matters before the dismissal of the case. But they did agree that they were still members of the same church. But that by reason of the religious beliefs of the undersigned and the nature of the said corporation, listen to this, the said matters in dispute should not be aired or presented to the foregoing court or to any other court whatsoever and wheresoever situated. That each of the undersigned does hereby agree for himself, his heirs, or his successors in office, that the foregoing disputes and questions or accounting will not be submitted or attempted to be submitted to any court or jurisdiction of any kind whatsoever outside of the limits of the corporate body of said corporation. So the agreement was what? That they are not going to take these issues outside of the corporate body. It is going to be brought where? To the corporate body. And that's what we are told we should do. If you take a look at the Bible, it tells us not to take each other to court. But we have a church court so that we can take it within the church court itself. It was further agreed that the sum of money which is now frozen in the Bank of America, main branch, Sacramento, California, shall be disposed of as follows. There was some money that belonged to the church that was frozen in Bank of America up to this point. And for that entire year, that account was frozen. And at this time, it was going to be released. And the agreement was that all the money was going to be given to D. Nikolic. He will then pay $2,000 to Adolf Haber and $500 to Bertha Maluman. These cashier's checks are to be turned over to Carlos Kotzel for him to forward to the various parties. These were simply previous debts that were owed by the church. Now, 9 witnesses signed the agreement, including Carlos Kotzel and D. Nikolic. Now, I can read C.T. Stewart, A. Ringelberg, A. Mueller, A. Lausevic, looks like J. Hartman, D. Nikolic, Eli Koski, Angel Cravioto, and Carlos Kotzel. So as you look at this signature list here, you can see that it was signed by both parties that separated in 1951 at the delegation session. Now, Brother Kotzel had to write a release to Bank of America. And he did so on May 7th, 1952, to release the money. And here's the document of release. And here's what it says. I hereby instruct you to pay over any and all sums wherever the same may have been deposited from said account to the depositor listed thereon, Dmitry Nikolaevich, trustee for the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement, the General Conference. This instruction and withdrawal of protest is made by me individually and as president of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement, the General Conference. And this was approved by the committee. And here's what the committee signed. We, the executive committee of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement, the General Conference, hereby join in the foregoing release of protest in the instructions herein above contained both individually and as members of the said executive committee. By these actions, by this document that was signed by the attorney's office there, and by the letter that was sent to the Bank of America to release the funds, we can see that they all agreed that they were members of the same church. Now, they disagreed at who was the leadership of that church, but they did agree that they were members of the same church. Now, after the failed attempt through the court of law, something strange happened. Instead of calling a new delegation session and all the delegates of 1951 to be evaluated to see what they did, whether it was right or wrong, instead of putting it in the hands of the new delegates, something else happened. You remember that other group in Denver? You remember that group that Brother Kotzel, when he was president in 1949, called them the three unclean spirits of Revelation? Something strange happened. Here's a letter of A.W. Dershler and Oscar Kramer to E.K. Natswani on June 18th, 1952. And it states here that this is a mutual agreement dated June 6, 1952. Just about a month later, here is an agreement that was signed. Here's what it says. At the occasion of the meeting of the majority of the General Conference Committee, with the Committee of the American Union during the Midwest Conference, Bailey, Colorado, June 4 to 8, 1952 in the United States, the disrupted harmony and connection was with God's help again restored. Both parties confessed and repented of their shortcomings. Everything shall henceforth be forgiven and forgotten. Closest harmony and complete cooperation shall mark the future course of this newly created union between the old American Union, chartered 1927, and the General Conference. The American Union acknowledges today, as before, the principles of faith of this reform movement which the Lord brought in life in 1914. Because the present experiences and in the interest of the advancement of the cause, we agree to call for a General Conference meeting as soon as possible. The American Union places their international and official connections into the hands of the leading General Conference Committee. All circular and explanatory writings originating and sent out by both sides are herewith declared as nullified. Their place shall be filled by a cordial agreement and a brotherly cooperation in Christ. All of our view and future, as well as all our efforts, shall be directed to the saving of souls. In this manner we shall receive the fullness of the Lord's blessing, knowing the coming of the Lord to be very near. It was further agreed that old Brother Velt become an honorable member of the General Conference Committee and that Brother Dershler become another member to represent the American Union. It may be rather human, after the sad experience we had with these brethren in the past, to question their sincerity. But we have seen the fruits of true repentance in such marked manner that it leaves us not a trace of doubt as to their earnestness and change of heart. They have met our conditions for unity to the full, and it would have been very unchristian and rude to have met them with an unforgiving spirit. This meeting was held with Brethren Mueller, Kotzel, Ringelberg, and Otto Welp was on the way, Dershler and Stable, and later with the American Union Committee. They went ahead and had this meeting, and they formed some kind of a union here. We're going to find out in a moment what kind of a union, what this was. Now, if you notice there, he mentioned that he they're going to call forth a new General Conference session as soon as possible. Of course, if we look at the spirit of prophecy, a new General Conference session of the Reform Movement would be the majority of the delegates of the Reform Movement. That would mean a good, 50, 60 delegates would have to come for that particular meeting to take place. This particular meeting in Denver, Colorado was held without a delegation session. And, by the way, in 1951, Kotzel was elected president, Mueller vice president. And in this new arrangement that they made, Kotzel was no longer there. Brother Stark was appointed president of the new organization, which then adopted the name of the American Union. This is that Derschler group that was organized in 1951. So Brother Derschler stepped down, Brother Kotzel stepped down, and they appointed Brother Stark to become the new president of the organization. This is again strange because if you remember 1949, Brother Kotzel called these the three unclean spirits of Revelation. And I don't see anywhere in the written documents, maybe I'm missing some, that he recognized that they were not that anymore. Quite strong letter when I read it to start with anyway. 1949, when I read that letter, I thought, how can a president of the Reform Movement be writing such things to anybody, even if they were true? Would you write something like that? I'd be very cautious about doing something of that nature. And yet, sad to say, those things are written. These two parties, the group led by Brother Kotzel and the group led by Brother Derschler, they're fighting with each other constantly, and finally they unite together. And then they fight together against Brother Nikolic. This is really a strange thing for us as the Reform Movement. Now, in another document here, this is a letter of October 2nd, 1952. It says this way, the conferences in Europe were a full success. Unity ruled in every line. In Germany, there were over 400 present. In Holland, over 300 souls. Brethren Charles, Adamzak, and Raphael have also united in full accord with the General Conference. The leading of the General Conference is temporarily in the hands of Brother Stark, Brother Ringelberg, Brother Egerter, and others till the next General Conference. But what happened to the entire organization of 1951? If 1951 was the right organization that was led by Brother Carlos Kotzel, why was the entire organization changed before the next session? As we can really see, the separation did not happen in 1951. The separation, first of all, took place with the Denver group prior to 1951, and this separation that took place was actually on June 6, 1952. So instead of calling a new delegation session to resolve some of these issues, they ended up uniting with another group that they've been having some difficulties with. That leads me to some questions in regards to Brother Ringelberg and Brother Mueller, if you remember, going over there after the meeting with the two groups in Holland, meeting them personally outside the fight against D. Nikolic. Is that what this was all about? So this new unity was formed June 6, 1952. That is when we can see the beginning of the International Missionary Society. Many attempts at unification were made, both immediately after the difficulties in 1951 as well as later. Quite a few attempts were made. The latest attempt was made in 1991 to 1993. And that's important to look at on its own, so we're going to look at that in our next lesson.
I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. I'd rather be His than have riches untold. I'd rather have Jesus than houses or lands. I'd rather be led by His nail-pierced hand than to be the king of a vast domain, or be held in sin's dread sway. than to be a king of a vast domain, or be held in sin's red sway. I'd rather have Jesus than anything. This world